Hey y'all, it's Darren. So this was a pretty amazing book for the first about first 40 pages, and then it started taking a really interesting turn. He really has done a great job, and this is one thing. If you are aspiring to be a really good scholar, one thing you need to be able to do is to be able to find diamonds in the rough. To be able to read your opponent's literature. And here's my neighbor's cat's about to attack whatever birds are out here today. We got the ducks, we got the heron, we got a hungry cat. Another example of this is in my study on trauma. I read an amazing book by this tremendous wokester named Grace Jones. And no, not Grace Jones, Serene Jones, excuse me. And very, very worthy book on trauma, because she did what we autistics do. She made it her special project. She read all the literature on trauma, and she is reporting back from her findings. But she doesn't realize that she's going to try to cause trauma and scapegoat the very people that she sees as the oppressors, who have scapegoated her people as she sees it. So there's this continuous, don't want to be Nietzsche in here, but there's an eternal return that might better be explained as the escalation to the extremes that is a part of the mimetic mechanism that leads to scapegoating. Will lead to our apocalypse if we can't figure out when it's going to happen at some point, but we want to try to delay it. We want to not immanentize the eschaton. So there's a lot to explain, because he says early in the book that I don't know of any autistic conspiracy to recruit people to autism. And I'm like, yeah, that's the way the gay community does. And he actually does say that the autistic movement needs to form up, it needs to muster itself, and then use identity group politics, the crybaby model, the cry-bully model of identity politics that the Pride community does, and the Me Too movement does, and the autistics need to have their own victim group as well. And yet he says he's not a part of conspiracy, but what is interesting is he's actually technically correct that it's not a conspiracy, or that he is not a part of the conspiracy. But what he doesn't understand is something that I'm here to describe today. And it comes from this amazing book from 2022 by Matthias Desmet, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, and this is one of those books that if you're one of the guys like me who are just really into hunting down and finding that buried treasure and finding the hidden things of life, the invisible things, the things that have been hidden since the foundation of time, for example, this is a really, really, really good book for that. And it's also interesting how this was one of the first things that I tried to start using to describe autistic tunnel vision, and that we saw it very clearly with COVID, that people were so focused on the COVID virus, the COVID victims, and the corona measures that they were unable to see the victims of the measures due to famine, domestic violence, poverty, etc., or the economic damage, or the deterioration of the general health and immunity, the violation of democratic and fundamental rights, the infringement of privacy, the psychological damage that was done. I mean, we're still learning here in halfway through 2025 the types of damage that has been done. You think about how important it was for kids, particularly autistic kids, or ADHD kids, that need to be able to watch the teacher's mouth move in order to be able to facilitate best the learning of language. And we've really we just can't understand what's happened at the margins of life. And so what happened is we kind of had this collective tunnel vision And when you have people who have tunnel vision to begin with, whether it's autists or, misandrists or one-issue people or ideologues or demagogues that are training us to watch the bouncing ball all the time, we miss a lot of this stuff. And boy, this is one of my favorite things. They all come landing in here right at sunrise. So, but that's not what I brought you here to talk about. Instead, what I really want to do is explain to you the Sierpinsky Triangle. If I can find it, there it is. Okay. So, try the following thought experiment. Put 3 dots far apart on a sheet of paper. Randomly put a 4th dot on the sheet anywhere you like. Then take a ruler, measure the distance between this 4th dot and any of the other 3 dots and divide it by 2, and then put a new dot there. Measure the distance between this new dot with any of the 3 initial dots, randomly indicated, and divide the distance again by 2 and put a new dot there. Repeat this process a few hundred times and you will witness an astonishing phenomenon. You will see that from the nebula of points, a Sierpinsky triangle. Oh, that Pinsky. I need to get that Pinsky file. The Sierpinsky Triangle will arise. The Sierpinsky Triangle is a fractal pattern that, from its overall composition to its tiniest detail, shows an identical pattern. And I'm sure an autist discovered this pattern that lies behind reality or undergirds reality. In this case, a triangle with an inscribed triangle. In other words, it will look like this. Let me make sure I get this right on here. Oh, that's Sierpinsky. We'll get him fixed up. So, you can easily carry out this process with 10, 100, or even more people who each take turns adding a point to the sheet of paper, blindly following the rules stipulated above without knowing what the purpose of their actions is. You will create this pattern together by all individually applying the same simple rule over and over and over again. This is relevant to what I will discuss in this chapter, and this chapter is on conspiracy and ideology. Upon seeing how a Sierpinsky triangle arises on a sheet of paper, a naive viewer would inevitably be under the impression that people making the points have detailed prior knowledge of the pattern and are working together in a planned and coordinated way. But the reality is different. Nobody needs to know or ever have even seen this pattern. It is enough that all people independently follow the same simple rules as they place their points. So keep this Sierpinsky triangle in mind as you read this chapter. It will resonate here and there. And so, I discovered this is a book of 2022, and so I discovered this idea for the first time when it came out. I don't know how this book came into my hands. I think it was perhaps recommended by, the Kirk Center or the University Bookman. And certainly right in our wheelhouse. But since I've read this, I've seen how this works on so many levels, especially, so I had read, Crowds in Power. I read Le Bon long before, but I read Crowds in Power by Elias Canetti when the George Floyd riots were breaking out. And so that would have been 2020, right? Yeah. And so ever since this, I've thought of many ways that the Sierpinsky triangle works perfectly with the idea of, the Kirkian critique of ideology, how it is really, attempt to be a terrible simplifier, to make simple rules that the mass man can follow then and know whether they are aligned with their political ideology. And so what it does is it kind of creates this group think, and it moves like a herd. It moves like a mass of men. And my poor ducks, they can't decide whether to come up and finish eating or not. And of course, my eye contact with them scares them off even more. But this also explains why the media is all lefty, okay? Of course, there is now a very healthy and counter reaction to that. But this is also not just a phenomenon that takes place on the left. Indeed, we see the willingness of the Trump movement as a very populist movement in which they're just going to follow a couple simple rules, and the first rule of all is never critique their master or their leader. And one of the best things you can do in terms of political enlightenment is read the Rapid Onset Political Enlightenment article that came out last fall, which explained the entire Obama movement and how it kind of came crashing down with Kamala Harris. Again, it is called Rapid Onset Political Enlightenment. It's a long read, but for those of us that have had in our careers our feet in every facet of politics, whether it be working in the ground game with the rough and tumble and the rank and file, or whether you were a member of the chattering class, the social aspect of it that meets at conventions, and it's a bunch of misfits clamoring for perceived or in some cases real power. But then you also have the intellectual side of it, the pre-political side of it, the pamphleteering side of it as well. There's just so many facets to it, and we're still talking about mass phenomenon. How is it that the typical mass man inevitably prunes himself so that way he follows the pattern? And I think the Sierpinsky Triangle is a wonderful template to see whether it fits in many of the phenomena that you see in the world today, particularly when we're talking, of course, about pop culture and mass media. So let me continue here to develop this out, because he does go on to distinguish between real conspiracy and fake conspiracy, and just this phenomena that happens. And so, are the leaders of the masses conspirators? Are mass formations and totalitarianism set in motion by a grand, sophisticated scheme coordinated by a few people behind the scenes? This is a legitimate question. Hannah Arendt, for example, frequently pondered this in her work on totalitarianism. Yeah, always happy when Hannah Arendt gets mentioned. She's one of my favorites. One thing is certain, throughout history, the leaders of the masses have often been perceived as conspirators. As the masses grew in strength and intensity throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, conspiracy theories also emerged. These conspiracy theories were typically used to explain complex social processes and mass formations. The mother of them all is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, whose popularity, according to Henry Rollin, was second only to the Bible in the early 20th century. It proclaimed that there was some kind of Jewish secret world government that controlled and ruled over all national governments. Despite its massive popularity, the protocols were a fabrication. Their fictitious origin is beyond dispute. They are based on a text published by French lawyer Maurice Joly in 1864 under the title Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, which, I would love to read that conversation. I think I read all of Peter Craif's imaginary conversations in Heaven and Hell, but definitely see the one about the three men that died the three men that died on the same day that JFK died. C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley is such a wonderful, wonderful read. Anyhow, well, there's a digression for you. So this dialogue between heaven and hell, dialogue in hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, a kind of pamphlet in which the author denounces Napoleon III's hunger for power. The text was edited and distorted by the Russian Secret Service Okhrana in the late 1800s with the intention of fueling anti-Semitism in Russia. The Okhrana retained about half of the original text, added a few paragraphs left and right, and consistently replaced France with world and Napoleon III with Jews. In this way, they manufactured a text which Theodor Herzl, founder of Zionism, was the head of a Jewish conspiracy that aspired to world domination. The forged pamphlet was published in 1905, at which point Russian conservatives and the Russian Orthodox eagerly adopted it to justify their anti-Semitic agenda. From there, it made its way into Germany during the first half of the 20th century and to the Middle East, where it remains extremely popular to this day, as you can imagine. The tendency to reduce large-scale mass formations to the machinations of an evil elite, however, dates back to earlier times, at least from the beginning of the Enlightenment. For example, in 1813, Chevalier de Maillet described theories asserting that the heroes of the French Revolution were actually secret agents of Masonic lodges, who, in turn, belonged to a wider revolutionary sect whose aim it was to manipulate the public rulers like pawns from behind the scenes. This theory was, in turn, based on the Moneda Secreta, an even older booklet describing a Jesuit conspiracy in an attempt to instigate a hate campaign against the establishment. Moneda Secreta was first published in 1612 and sold at book markets all over Europe until the end of the 20th century. The above theories are, in fact, full-fledged conspiracy theories, but nowadays the term conspiracy theory is bandied about even when it concerns theories that don't make any mention of conspiracy at all. For this reason, it is good to first pursue some conceptual rigor and define the term. According to Wikipedia, conspiracy is, quote, a secret plan or agreement between persons for an unlawful or harmful purposes, while keeping their agreement secret from the public or from other people affected by it. This definition shows that there are at least three core characteristics which must be present for an activity to be classified as conspiracy. One, there has to be a conscious, intentional, and planned endeavor. Two, this endeavor has to be hidden or secret. Three, the endeavor has to be aimed at inflicting harm. That is, there must be some malice towards someone involved. In current usage, however, the term denotes a wide range of theories. It is sometimes used accurately to refer to theories about global shadow governments, such as the Illuminati or the Cabal, that would steer world history in its entirety, or even more exotically, about elites of extraterrestrial origin, more reptilian than human, who have the world in their grip. See, for example, the QAnon discourse. Boy, I'm sure glad I don't hear much about that anymore. I wonder what happened to it. Ugh, I'm so glad I'm not reading the Times, but rather the Eternities. But the term is also currently used incorrectly to deride critiques of power structures at the levels of banking, politics, industry, economics, and media. The term, therefore, has become a stigma, a discursive means by which the dominant discourse protects itself from critical reflection. It's a thought stopper. It's a dialogue stopper. Likewise, the term conspiracy is rarely, if ever, used to refer to theories that are in line with the dominant story and yet are actual conspiracy theories. For example, consider the claim that Russia is trying to steer U.S. elections and that the Chinese government is behind cyber attacks that Steve Bannon is currently circulating. Reports that the virus originated in the lab in Wuhan. The Russian funds all kinds of anarchist newspapers in the West, and so on. Whether these assertions are accurate or not, and they are in essence actual conspiracy theories. The only reason they are not stigmatized as such is that they belong to the dominant social discourse that is constructed every day through the mainstream media. And my comment here is that the mainstream media sanitizes real conspiracies, both on the left and the right. It's interesting that Matthias decided to pick out one of the rare ones that's a conspiracy theory being buttressed by the talking heads in the media, on the right-wing media. He didn't point out the ongoing one that's been happening for about 100 years. Well, longer than that, 1890, the Progressive Era began in earnest. So that said, we must return to the question, should we consider mass formations the result of conspiracy? In the crowd, the individual soul is replaced by a common group soul, noted Gustave Le Bon. And he did this back in like 1893. I mean, he was way ahead of his time. The crowd acts in a coordinated way and repeats the same slogans. It engages in thoughts and expressions that spread through its ranks at lightning speed. Le Bon described it as the contagiousness of thoughts in a crowd. Every segment of society participates in this pensée unique, pense unique. Politicians, academics, the press, experts of all kinds, judges and police officers. In this way, the masses give the impression of a highly organized phenomenon. Those who, for one reason or another, are not sensitive to the mass formation, people like yours truly, and who observe this social phenomenon from the outside, tend to think that it must be the result of a large-scale conscious and planned coordination. In other words, the detached outsiders see it as coordinated rather than as simple crowd dynamics. And we need to be able to understand not only Le Bon's point, but Elias Canetti's point that builds upon that, and realize that this is the threshold into mimetic theory. And it is also, interestingly enough, the gateway back to what Christ inscribed on the ground that we have not been able to discover. We may have discovered it now. But what he's talking about in this whole scenario with Christ is to not cast the first stone. Because the first stone, as Monty Python taught us in The Life of Brian, once that first stone is thrown, everybody else wants to join in. And it becomes a contagion. And someone is scapegoated by a unanimous crowd who is unaware of the fact that they have lost their individuality, they've lost their agency, and they're swept up in the social contagion that becomes murderous. And this is, mimetic theory at its best, explaining, not only Southern lynchings, but also the formation of civilizations, archaic religions, throughout all of time, and how Christ completely turns this system on its head and says, no more scapegoats. No, we're not going to have any more founding murders. We're not going to let Romulus murder Remus. We're not going to let Cain slay Abel. No more nailing Christ to the tree or giving Socrates hemlock. No more sending people to gas chambers or the Gulag archipelagos. No more cancel culture. That's the point of the Christian sacrifice. It's one of nonviolence. It's of saying we've got to love our neighbor, because, and it's a bitch of a command. But we need to be able to be detached outsiders and not be one who follows the guy who threw the first stone. We need to be able to stand outside of that, even though we know that if we stand athwart the mob, it is likely going to turn against us. And that's a very scary thing. That's a call to courage that a lot of people are not willing to do because they're merely trying to protect their prestige, and in some sense rightly so that they can have a place of order and safety in which to raise their kids. But in chapter 6, I explained, going back to Matthias here, in chapter 6 I explained that mass formation is largely the result of individuals being gripped by a common narrative that unites them in a heroic battle against an object of anxiety. Exactly how much of this line of reason explains about the phenomenon of mass formation remains to be seen. For instance, there seems to be, and by the way, I did check, he nowhere mentions mimesis in this book. He doesn't mention Girard or any of the mimeticists, and he does mention mirror neurons, but that's about as close as he gets to the language of mimeticists. The phenomena has direct similarities with the way complex dynamic systems organize themselves in nature. A well-known example of this is the way that starlings swarm. At dusk, the starlings fly towards each other from all directions to begin to move together in a harmonic pattern, so perfect that Nobel Prize winner Nicholas Tinbergen called the flock a super individual, a kind of overarching entity in which all individuals are connected to one another like cells of the same body. And Alasdair MacIntyre kind of called this he did call this the social imaginary that can grip us so tightly that we can't even free ourselves to think outside the box, so to speak. Oh, I hate that. I've said it a million times, never to use cliches. They sense, so anyways, they're like cells of the same body. They sense each other perfectly without any observable form of communication directing their behavior. Again, this is kind of that theory of mind concept, is that I am able to read the mind of my fellows, their intents, know where they're going next, and coordinate myself to conform to that movement. This is what autists don't have. We have more or less dysfunctioning theories of mind modules in our heads. And what that means is that it makes it very difficult for us to, it has to be a cognitive thing that we actually have to consciously model ourselves, pretend to be normal in order to fit in with the mass man. So we kind of come always from this detached outsider point of view, or we are able to, and this is what is very interesting about this book. And I've said in the previous videos I've made on this book, I've read the first and second chapters, and I've given my comments as I go through it, and I'm really impressed with some of the things that he has found along the way about autism. And one of the things that's interesting is his concept of neural pruning, that autists don't neural prune like normies do, and which means, and also the fact that we are hyperactive brains who, 42% more brain activity and blah, blah, blah. We have far more inputs, and because we don't trim our mirror neurons, there's far more noise, which goes back to this concept that Matthias is talking about, is that often talking to an autist, we're actually communicating everything to them, but the only thing that they can see is their very narrow perspective. And the more frustrated an autist becomes, the more narrow this gets. And I think we saw this particularly in the COVID pandemic, was that people who have real anxiety problems, this thing got really narrow. And so there was so many of the efforts made to seize control, and the mass became an emblem of totalitarianism. And I've probably done enough to make the point of the Sierpinsky Triangle. Oh yeah, Kennedy is mentioned here, so I'm definitely have to finish this section. So from Tinbergen's super individual, like cells in the same body, we turn to Elias Kennedy. The way in which individuals in a crowd establish connection with one another is similar. This is particularly visible when a crowd physically gathers. Kennedy describes it in the following way. The crowd, suddenly there where it was nothing before, is a mysterious and universal phenomenon. A few people may have been standing together, 5, 10, 12, not more. Nothing has been announced, nothing is expected. Suddenly, everything is swarming with people, and more come streaming from all sides as though streets had only one direction. Most of them do not know what has happened, and, if questioned, have no answer. But they hurry to be there where most other people are. There is a determination in their movement that is clearly different from the expression of ordinary curiosity. It seems as if the movement of one transmits itself to the others. But that is not all. They also have one goal, which is there before they can find words for it. And that goal is the most intense darkness where the most people are gathered. And then when they get there, they're undifferentiated, and it turns into a mosh pit. A mosh pit, excuse me. This means that the crowd is not only united by the same thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors, it also seems to form a kind of physical unity, which contributes to the overwhelming impression that it is the product of an immense plan schemed. Now, if it is an immense plan scheme when people are counting on this type of crowd reaction. Kennedy makes this fantastic point that all you really need are crowd crystals in the crowd, and you can cause a violent reaction. Especially if your operatives have placed pallets of bricks in strategic locations around the mustering points. That is just ridiculous. I mean, it's just, you can then false flag any of your opponent's operations. And, this is why Antifa being masked is so very useful to the left, is they can be, they can be a rent-a-mob, a violent men-a-rob. That you can, a violent insurgency, as Dedra Menno, or whatever heck her name is in Andor, would say, what you need is a radical insurgency that you can count on to do the wrong thing. And, Antifa becomes merely, just a nihilist fire starter for hire. So what does that have to do with this book? The reason why I'm going to this book is that to question the few points that are made in wherever the points of the Sierpinsky Triangle are placed will cause a violent reaction from the left today. In other words, those that try to not walk in that pattern will be, marked down for mistreatment and likely canceled. And so what am I trying to say is that the movement has a couple simple rules that they follow, and then the whole movement lines up that sweeps everybody along into it. And that's precisely what the gay movement is attempting to do, is that it realizes I should really be very careful about how I talk about this here, but the simple rules that are being followed by the Pride movement is that there's nothing wrong with it, even if on average the average male homosexual has 1,000 partners in his life and the average lesbian has 2. So we can't say that they're the same thing, first of all. He makes in this book that it's likely not genetically predetermined anyways. So he's open to the gate theory of homosexuality. He understands, to some degree, trauma, but he's not willing to see whether or not part of the gates towards homosexuality and some of these issues are due to trauma in early childhood. He's also unwilling to see that what he is himself doing is very much the cult dynamic of preying upon the vulnerable. And so after a while of reading through what was some pretty good insight, I saw him kind of backing himself into this terrible simplification of the ideologue's useful idiot. And he's merely begins to parrot as presuppositions the pride premises, and in so doing he doesn't see what he is actually doing. And let me give you an example here, because it's so easy to. How about I just start here, chapter 6. He says, "Why we unmask?" And he's talking about autists here, but he does. Which chapter does he really get into the whole trans thing? I think that's before he even reaches page 100. Yeah, he actually does a really good job of talking about masking. It's not without error, because he thinks that masks are always bad. He hasn't encountered the idea of alterity yet, and so he thinks masks are just almost bad. It's like for him, it is analogous to being in the closet as a gay person. When masks hide more than autism, there are any number of things hiding under your mask. This mask goes on very early in life to protect you from the judgments of others, which can mean a lot of different things depending on the particular culture into which you were born. We've all seen people, so he's implying traumatic injury at a young age here. But he'll never say that that might be a point of departure for the kid's natural development into his full fruition. A branching of the autistic tree is the example that I use, and I'll lay this out in my own presentation. But I'm using this as a riff now to kind of talk through some of my own thoughts. So when you understand that the autist, like the narcissist, has received some type of injury that is related to the other and is connected somehow to the capacity for empathy. With the autist, it is a disordered theory of mind. It's either slow or delayed, or it can be very, very sharp much later on, after the person has ruminated about what actually happened and replaying in their mind the expressions and the facial expressions and the body language. They can figure it out cognitively much later, even more sharply perhaps than a normie would have, even though they were able to get it from the get-go. So the mask goes on early to protect you from the judgments of others, which can mean a lot depending on the particular culture into which you were born. We've all seen people struggling with the pressure to live up to others' expectations. It's obvious in the case of a father who wants to live out his baseball dreams through his son, or when there is pressure to carry on the family business, but it can go several layers deeper than that. It's easy to compartmentalize in our minds, but in real life, very few things are just one thing. Which is a really good point here. We need to keep in mind that autism is a resistance to the forces of socialization. No, it's not. I think he's conflating oppositional defiance disorder, pathological demand avoidance, or persistent drive for autonomy. Autistic spectrum disorder people. Oh wait, what ASP? What the heck am I trying to think of here? Are autists. I don't even know my own darn notes here. Oh yeah. He talks about, he's constantly contradicting his own points in this book. But much we think about, see here's where he starts going off the line. It's easy to compartmentalize this stuff in our minds, but in real life, few things are just one thing. We need to keep in mind that autism is a resistance to the forces of socialization, which are responsible for many aspects of our identities that people mistake for biological determinants. What he's confusing here is that, no, we're all socially constructed. Okay, a man that does not have any contact with society will never develop. He'll never grow out of the preternatural consciousness. He won't encounter language. He won't encounter the ability to use his ratio. And as you'll learn here further on, this guy really is suggesting that we don't ever develop the detached consciousness, but rather fall back into a rather preternatural consciousness that even stands athwart the consciousness of the eminent human consciousness, which is the group animal in many ways. So he's calling us to sink lower than the animals in a way. So much of what we think of as biological roles are just social roles with biological leanings. He can't begin to imagine how that it might be the absolute inverse of that. That why is it then that in almost every anthropological study done of every society, there are the norm is man and wife, husband and wife playing the roles that are we now can see are something that are kind of cooked into our genes. But he thinks that social roles aren't cut and dried except in cases related to procreation on a large scale. Sure, that's fine, but it's a Mott and Bailey fallacy. For example, learning the physiological sex of your baby through a sonogram starts the socialization of gender even before birth. What sex is it? It's a little early to start imposing roles, don't you think? And no phenomenon makes that clearer than the gender reveal party. You gather a lot of people in your home and you have some kind of colored balloon surprise and let everyone know how to begin conditioning the unborn child. This sets up enormous expectations 20 weeks before the kid even enters the world, cutting off roughly half of their potential futures. What a crock of shit. Autism is antidotal to this to some degree. Autisms are 6 to 8 times more likely to be members of the LGBTQIA plus community when compared to allistics. Allistics, in case you didn't know, are people who are neurodivergent that are not autistic, but rather are ADHD, have oppositional defiance disorder, or other disorders that are not autistic, but are now classified as neurodivergent. In fact, if you are transgender, including non-binary, you are 6 times more likely to be autistic than a cisgendered person. And yet this is not in the DSM, the Diagnosis Standardization Manual, which tells you why you're crazy. That pathologizes in one way or another almost every behavior, but is not willing. And of course, we'll talk about this in a second. The social conditioning that comes along with what gender you should be, whom you should be having relationships with, and how those relationships should look, is not smoothly communicated through our autistic neurons. This can lead to some big discoveries for late identified autistic, who begins to deconstruct their mask, which has been faking perceived normalcy for years. Sherry is a client of mine who always considered herself to be heterosexual. She was married to a man for 15 years and 2 of them never had any big problems. Far from feeling like their marriage was ever in danger, Sherry observed that she never felt mightily attracted to other men. Every so often I would think about how strange it was. She told me that other moms I talked to would talk about some guy and maybe they're just, maybe there's poor white trash that have no sense of dignity or decorum, But she told me other moms I talked to would talk about some guy in Bridgerton or a football player as if they'd like to ride off in the sunset with him. And I always felt like I had to repress a gag reflex at the thought. She knew that her husband would sometimes find other women attractive, and while she understood that this was normal, it also didn't strike her as fair. It seemed like he was tacitly making a choice to find someone attractive, as if attraction was partially a character judgment. After all, I was attracted to him in part because he was such a good, nice person. I think that it felt on some level like a choice to have been attracted to him. Yeah, merely esteeming someone is not loving them, okay? You cannot reason your way in to love. Love is something that happens to you. And it is also something that you must do. Falling in love is like falling into the pool. It's taking the lover's leap. But once in the pool, you've got to have the spiritual stamina to keep paddling. Many people, as this is all stolen from C.S. Lewis from his Four Loves, he says that the fattest is the guy that keeps jumping from one pool to the next, like Casanova, and that he doesn't have the spiritual stamina to stay in that relationship, and so he climbs out of one pool and then dives in another. And so I'm not saying that's what's happening here. He himself is not saying these are specific case studies. He's embellished them all and combined them all to make it. Obviously, that's the easiest way to have it serve your agenda if you have one. But when I met her, he says, as a therapist, she'd come to him. I'd known she was autistic for about a year and gay for about 6 months at the time. It hit me like lightning one day, she said. We were watching the show with a sort of down-to-earth female character. She wasn't a big actress or anything, and I kept thinking, gosh, I feel like I could be friends with her. Like we have so much in common. And those thoughts kept hitting her. It was like I wanted to be like her in some ways. You can probably see where this is going. No, where this goes is that this is typical mimesis, where we find role models that we admire and then we want to imitate them, okay? This does not necessarily mean that everybody that we want to imitate, we want to have sex with, okay? That is hardly the point, okay? We're not all pansexuals. Esteem is not eros. But it hit me all at once. I was into her. I was into women. I had always been into women, but I had never let myself be into women. This moment of realization made so much sense to her and brought so much of her life into immediate focus that she excitedly told her allistic husband about it without considering the implications. He was excited and started seeing how it made so much sense, and then all of a sudden there was this look on his face. His smile fell, and he had these big puppy dog eyes. I told him that it wouldn't change us, that it was just interesting and fascinating, but that we didn't have to worry. Now here we go. Sherry was raised in a very religious environment. Her family had a highly structured life, and it all revolved around the church. She memorized Bible verses and wasn't allowed to wear makeup or pants, only skirts. The expectation was that she would become a wife and raise children in the church. She had always struggled with those presumptions, but she never realized that she was grappling with her sexuality. Now, let's not talk about gay church, where they have certain presumptions, certain expectations, certain prohibitions, and highly structured thinking and behaving. But where you don't have to grapple with your sexuality, anything goes, babe. I knew our church's attitude towards homosexuality was wrong. I knew gay people in school, and they were good people. Mott and Bailey. See, this is the thing. Of course, many gay people are good, just like many heterosexuals are good. But there are also many gay people who are not good. Okay? And there are as many victimizers in the gay community as there are predators. Victims as there are predators. Perhaps even more victims. However, so I knew they weren't going to hell. But you could add to this any more than a philanderer or an adulterer would go to hell. It says it's a sin. It's just that I had main character energy. And I always figured that being gay was for someone else, not me. Some part of me knew that I would probably leave the church, and some part of me knew that I wanted to have a career, but I never once imagined kissing a girl. All this backstory was where we started our coaching relationship. She was moving into her own place with a girlfriend and had just gone through a peaceful but painful separation from her husband. Yeah, sure, it's going to just be fine. Some days I just thought, screw it, I'll put my mask back on. I don't care, I love him, I care for him, and we will make this work. Yeah, so much for that marriage vow, huh? Other days I knew it wasn't fair to either of us. Some social constructs root deeper than others. See, he's always blaming social constructs for all of our problems and not our individual constructs. As Ralph Cram says, the human being is merely the raw material out of which an occasional person may be constructed. This guy is not talking about formation of personality. He's not talking about structuring our souls and our minds in a way for us to rise towards sainthood, but rather he's doing, this is the big lie of Freudian psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is not interested in making good people. Psychoanalysis is primarily the idea of reconciling your consciousness, your ratio, your reasonable thought, reconciling your mind with your gut, your balls, your instincts, the id, okay? And rejecting the superego. The superego is that yammering voice of your parents, your peers, and pop culture that teaches you how to fit into society. Freudian psychoanalysis basically says get rid of the superego, although we kind of need it, the religion, all that kind of stuff is good. It completely misses the concept of the conscience, which is that inbuilt navigation system that yammers at us like Jiminy Cricket. It's the voice of the Holy Spirit that tells us when we are doing something wrong and when we're not, and leads us. And it's, like I say, it's the voice of the Holy Spirit. It's that inbuilt navigation system that always points due north. And then, so what Freudian psychoanalysis does is basically reconciles the id with the conscience and makes us feel really good about being bad about ourselves. It's really designed to generate feelings of well-being in the mind of the patient. Well-being is their concern. not actually doing well. So if you can feel well by reconciling, by rejecting everybody in your life that doesn't affirm you, you should be able to feel well and be happy. The problem is it doesn't work. In some sense, all we're doing is creating sociopaths, because we're telling them to reject their conscience, because their peers, parents in pop culture, although any culture, may be telling them the right thing to do. They may be rejecting all of that, and sociopathically, just following their own desires without any regard to the damage they can cause others. So obviously, the point I'm making here is that we should not just be creating, a bunch of horny devils that feel really good about themselves. Because when we do that, as we can see from the statistics, and this is the thing, gays, women, whatever oppressed identity group you want to talk about has, in America, never had it better. There's never been more opportunities. But in almost each one of these groups, what do you see? In each one of these groups, you see a greater misery, a greater dissatisfaction in life, higher rates of self-harm and addictive behavior. So, they're getting more and more of what they want, but it's not making them happier and happier. And my suggestion is, it's because they become herd animals that are running off the cliff, rather than doing the hard work of realizing that there's an enduring moral order that we need to ascertain and conform our souls and our minds to it. And that in so doing, we rise from the mere animalistic, eating and fucking human. We rise through that from the ego comparative, making and consuming person that is always just trying to keep up with the Joneses, to, and this is Father Spitzer's idea of the 4 levels. The third level is when we become empathetic and we want to contribute to our society. And I translate this as that we've gone through metanoia. We become awakened souls. We realize that there's a hierarchy above merely just our own enlightened self-interest, however fruitful and innocent that might have been. After a while, we stop merely caring about getting more stuff, whether it be prestige or cash or possessions, and we want to give back to the community. That's that third level. And then the fourth level is when, we not only want to give back to the community, but we want to serve the Lord. And that's when the stuff really starts getting good. And that's also when the Sierpinsky Triangle kind of starts working in our favor. Because when you've climbed that mountain to the upper echelon, and you're in the upper regions of human thought, and you're hanging out with saints, they kind of form up their own Sierpinsky